Please note, this interview with Larson from Going in Raw was recorded prior to the untimely passing of the Enforcer, Stevie Bradley. We love you and we miss you, Enforcer. Rest in peace.
Some of that stuff is the most fun we have ever had working together.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Tom Talk Trash, and stand back for another interview. This time, I'm joined once again by the one and only Larson from Going in Raw. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. It's been a couple of years since we last chatted. I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Likewise, my friend. So if we take this back to the beginning, where do you discover wrestling, but as a fan?
We probably have to go back almost 40 years. So apologies if some of the details aren't quite right, but in a general sense, this is how I remember it. Probably, I don't know, I was 7, 8 years old, going through the channels, landed on the USA Network, and one of WWF shows were on at the time. I want to say it was over the weekend. And I remember the match being the Killer Bees versus the British Bulldogs, even though I won a cage match. I can find no record of that match happening on WWTV in the mid-'80s. But I do remember landing on it and just being captivated by what I saw there because it was so different and so weird compared to everything else that I was watching at the time on TV. And like my dad was, pretty clear early on, like, this isn't real. These wrestlers aren't actually fighting in the ring. He used the word fake. And it really didn't make much difference in terms of my interest level. I was super into it, had the thumb wrestler toys and all that kind of stuff. And for probably 5, 6, 7 years, I was really, really into it.
Do you know what it was that made you almost like, I don't care that it's fake, quote unquote?
It was probably the world building. Looking back at it now, growing up in the 80s, there was, a bunch of high concept, highly produced shows that I would watch at the time, whether it was, like Knight Rider or Airwolf, or even some of the cartoons at the time, like G.I. Joe and Transformers. It was all really high concept stuff. And each property had their own very distinct means of building their universes, their worlds, but especially when it comes to TV production, it was a pretty standard format. And then you come across something that's so different in how they approach their world building, so different in terms of the visual language of how that world is presented. It really stuck out, and it was something that was so unique and so different from what I was accustomed to. And you add on top of that all these huge characters, and at the time, work rate wasn't a concept I was aware of, and it really wasn't something that was necessarily regularly highlighted on WTV back then. Although, on occasion you have a Macho Man match or a Steamboat match, or later on, Brett or Shawn Michaels and any number of the wrestlers back then that could really work, that could really wrestle. So you got the huge characters, you got from time to time, you got the real athletic work rate based matches. And it was I think it was just this universe that was so different and so unique from anything else that I knew was on TV that it just really captured my imagination. I couldn't stop watching it.
So when you do discover this, what is your consumption at that point? Is it like anything you can get your hands on?
To a point. At the time, I was living in a pretty small town. It's before we moved up to Northern California, and so, if I was around on Saturday or Sunday and it was on, I'd watch it. There was the one local video store when they got WrestleMania 1 in. I rented that all the time. Rented WrestleMania 2 a few times, but even back then I realized that show wasn't very good. And
2
then
is the one where there's 3 locations, right?
Yeah. It's a disjointed mess. And then they'd have 3 and I'd watch that a lot too. So but usually I'd always go back to WrestleMania 1 for whatever reason. It was, it's really the start of the boom period that WWE had. And there was an energy about it, I guess, at the time that was really interesting.
Mm. You brought up the characters and the world building being a reason that you loved wrestling back when you were younger. So, if you were to discover wrestling now, the way it is now as a child, do you think you'd be into it? But also to flip the question, if you discovered wrestling the way it was as when you were a child, do you think you'd be into it as an adult now? If you had no prior knowledge, I mean.
Um, so if I was mid 40s me and just discovered 80s style wrestling, I don't know if I would be as into it because
Mm,
the over the top characters and the lack of emphasis on in ring action and storytelling at the time might not have been as interesting for me as opposed if I discovered it now as a kid. I think if I was watching now as a kid, you don't have the over the top characters, obviously, to the same degree as you did back then. But
mm,
I think I would be really fascinated by seeing people in the ring doing these incredible feats of athleticism and making it look effortless.
mm,
Um, you see somebody do a moonsault or something like that now, and I'm like, wow, that's really darn impressive. But if I discovered that when I was 7, it would have blown my mind, you know?
mm.
Um, so, I mean, I think in that sense, I think young Larson would be far more interested in the product now as opposed to current day Larson being interested in the product in the 80s.
Mm.
Um,
You, sorry.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
One thing I am curious to know, obviously, you and the good friend Steve have a great podcast. How do you think podcasting would have worked when we were younger, like in the 90s or 80s? If we had the technology, do you think it would have worked?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Back in say the Attitude Era when uh, there was, obviously Meltzer had been doing the newsletter for a good number of years at that point, but then there was a lot of wrestling news sites that was springing up all over the internet, and the veracity of the news they had on there, varied significantly from day to day and site to site. I mean, I really remember waiting in eager anticipation for the Hardy Boys to join DX back in the day because there were sites reporting that was going to happen, or Kane was going to be in DX, or Val Venus was going to be in DX. Those were all reports and rumors that were going around back then. And heck, if someone was forward thinking enough and the means existed in the late 90s, early 2000s, have a wrestling podcast when the business was at its most popular probably ever. I mean, they would have done pretty well at the time.
Mm,
Especially if they were out in front, and one of the first to do it. I mean, back then, the level of interest in wrestling was incredible, and you'd think people would want to hear, podcasts about that, news about that. So yeah, I think if the means existed, yeah, podcasting would have been wrestling podcasting in particular would have been huge during the Attitude Era for sure.
mm. You brought up the Attitude Era there. So, how does your fandom change once the Attitude Era begins almost?
So I kind of stopped watching maybe 92 or 93 on a regular basis and then got back into it because a buddy of mine who continued watching mentioned that about Scott Hall showing up in WCW. And at the time, I had no idea what WCW was. Growing up in my mind, WWF was wrestling and that was it. But I knew who Razor Ramon was. And so I think it was around the time shortly after the Giant joined the NWO that I started watching WCW. It's like, wow, this is so different. It's they're making an effort to ground at least some of the characters in some semblance of reality. There's not as many huge over the top gimmicky, even vocational type characters like there was, especially in the early 90s in WWF. And it felt like a breath of fresh air because these grounded characters felt more relatable. And then you get the story of the NWO that has elements of reality in it mixed in with it, and it was interesting stuff. And then I remember hearing about the Montreal Screwjob and thinking, well, that's even in the world of pro wrestling, that's really weird that they would cost somebody the title like that, in a choreographed, predetermined sport. And so the Raw after the Survivor Series 97, I watched that and saw Vince do the Brett screwed Brett thing and seeing the contrast between what WWF was presenting at the time versus WCW. And I had a circle of friends who were, for the most part, all watching, and so we'd all watch it. We get together, we talk about it, and then a lot of us moved uh, to Southern California, go to college together, and so that was a regular Monday thing. Is we'd all get together, and some friends from school would come over, and we'd watch wrestling, and it was just as much a social thing as it was entertainment. And then we got into the video games, WCW versus NWO World Tour, Revenge, and then WrestleMania 2000 and No Mercy, and that just really kicked things up a notch from there. So yeah, it really changed. Going back to talking about the wrestling news sites and finding places to read up on rumors and how that either enhanced my viewing experience or not. It was an interesting time to see this kind of a lot of things kind of falling into place at one time, where you had wrestling at its hottest period it probably ever has and probably ever will have, with the internet becoming a more prominent thing, and sites on there with their sources, with their news, and writing news reports, and having those rumors feed into your viewing experience. Yeah, it was something else. It was a pretty exciting time to be a wrestling fan, that's for sure.
You talked about the social aspect of wrestling and having friends come over. I assume by this time you've met Steve?
Yeah, so I met Steve in mid-90s. He always likes to point out that he was a junior in high school. I was a senior. We met in physics class. And he started becoming good friends with a friend of mine that I'd known for a number of years. So we were acquaintances at the time in high school, but then I graduated, and the following year after he graduated from high school, we ended up in a couple classes together in junior college. And one of them, a friend of his, had dropped the class. So he was, as he tells it, he was looking around the classroom looking for someone to sit next to, and he saw me down there. So he just sat next to me, and a friendship was born.
So when that friendship is born, obviously you can see how close you guys are on screen now. And off screen, I assume. I don't know. Off screen, I assume as well. Was that friendship instant, or was it like, I need some time to get to know you? We needed some time to get to know each other.
I think there was a little bit of time, but I think we figured out pretty early on how to make each other laugh. And I think still a large part of our relationship and our chemistry is that we know how to make each other laugh. And still almost knowing each other 30 years later, still knowing how to do that. We talk about a great number of things. But I think at its heart, especially the chemistry on the show is we just know, all right, if I say this right now, he's going to laugh about it. That comes with familiarity. It comes with knowing somebody for 30 years. I think kind of that's at the heart of the chemistry we have.
You brought up the chemistry there that you both have on Guy and Emerald. How different is your on-camera chemistry as opposed to your off-camera?
Oh, I think it's at its root, it's the same thing. Like as I mentioned, we know how to make each other laugh, and whether we're doing a show or not, that's the case. Yeah. No, I think maybe what we do on the show is kind of a snapshot of how we would converse outside of the realm of going in raw, if you will. Because we went to film school, we like talking movies and TV. And stuff like that, and it's more or less the same thing. Is someone will say something, and we're like, oh, I could pop him with a joke here, and whether we're talking about wrestling on the show or something else, that's kind of our approach. It seems like.
You brought up Guy and Emerald a few times. So how do you and Steve start podcasting together?
So we were working for a company called Machinima. Used to be a pretty large sized YouTube channel. I started working there, I want to say 2008. And then I got Steve brought on initially to do some voiceover work, and then we started doing shows together. And through doing one of those shows, we got introduced.
Apologies if you can hear my dog, by the way, guys.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Steve's dog barks on the show from time to time. So, So we got introduced to Dan Nerdcubed through Machinima to do a collaboration video, and we hadn't met him before, so we were on, I think, Skype at the time, and we're just talking. We end up talking for an hour before we even do any work, and we spent a lot of that time talking about wrestling. And at one point, I think Steve says, this sounds like a podcast, and then Dan says, and we should call it Going in Raw. And that's literally how the show was born. So it was September of 2014 we did the first show. And it was after, I want to say, Night of Champions, that pay-per-view. And that was kind of the concept of it, is we'll watch the pay-per-view, we'll record the show Monday morning, so you have everything you need to know going into that night's Raw. And so at first it was just monthly. And then Steve and I would try to, we got laid off from Machinima in 2015. And we were kind of trying to decide what we were going to do. We're going to pursue the gaming stuff, and said, we'd done pretty well in that sphere for a while. Or do we want to pursue the wrestling stuff? Because at the time, that was something we were more interested in, more passionate about. We decided to pursue the wrestling aspect of things. And that was 2016, early 2016, that we really started focusing on that. And like that March, we said, all right, this is what we're going to do. And then by that summer, things really started rolling.
So when you are laid off and you talked about, we're going to pursue the wrestling stuff because that's what we're more passionate about. Did you ever have a moment where it was like, or have you ever had a moment in the 7 or so years that you've been doing the show that you're like, I'm slowly losing my passion for wrestling because I'm talking about it so much? I'm
going to say slowly losing passion. I think the closest
that might have been the wrong word. I do apologize.
No, but I understand the general premise, and I think the closest we got to that was we used to do, like during pandemic, prior to pandemic, we had an office, and we would come into work at 9 a.m. and stuff like that, and that was all fine. After pandemic, or during pandemic when it first started, we started working from home exclusively, which we still do. And we were like, all right, since we're home, there's no reasons why we can't do Raw recaps right after the show, SmackDown recaps right after the show, Dynamite recaps right after the show. And so for a while it was fine, but those Monday nights when we were watching Raw on the West Coast, on the East Coast feed, so from 5 to 8 p.m. on the West Coast, and then doing a show after it. And these were like, when this is pandemic Raws, when there was no crowds or even Thunderdome Raws, it was tough. It was tough to do those shows on a regular basis and keep the energy up. And so we just made a decision. All right, we'll do the Raw recaps on Tuesdays, and it turned into kind of a thing because it got picked up by some places, and it kind of got turned into, well, the show that only covers Raw is not covering Raw because Raw is so bad now,
Who did it get picked up by, out of curiosity?
Oh, it was a couple like wrestling news sites. I think there was maybe something on Reddit about it or something like that. It wasn't like a huge deal. We just thought it was kind of funny because they based on, because we put we did an introduction to one of the shows saying this is what we're going to do, and posted that clip on Twitter, I think, and then it kind of got a life of its own from there. But just the idea that we named the show after Raw, and that was like the one show we covered, and because Raw is so bad now, we just stopped covering it, which wasn't the case totally. It was funny how it got picked up like that. But that's the closest we've gotten for where we're so fortunate to do what we do, because 99.9% of the time it doesn't feel like work. It just feels like we're having a conversation like we normally would about something we both enjoy. But when doing the Monday Night Raw recaps, when Raw was not very good, that was the closest it's ever been to being like, this is getting a little tough. But if that's as tough as it gets, I have absolutely nothing to complain about,
100%, and I agree with you, because I'm exactly the same. So when it comes to, you talked about there, doing recaps after the show sometimes, or I know you said before, no, it's not the word I'm looking for, after the show, how is a recap different for when you're doing it straight after Dynamite, for example, until maybe you're waiting till the Thursday, for example?
That's a good question. So would we do the shows right after, say, Dynamite or Raw or SmackDown? It's as close as we can get to an instantaneous reaction to what happened. And sometimes it's nice the following day because it gives you the opportunity to think about it, reflect on things. Maybe there's some news about a segment or two that adds some context to what happened on the show. So in that respect, I feel like waiting allows us to give a better, more full-fledged take on what happened. Because sometimes something like, for example, when Jay White shows up on Dynamite on Wednesday, and that's
at
cool.
time of recording, I will say that.
Yeah, and it was like, wow, that's pretty neat. And then you read in the news the next day about how WB, like kind of stopped talking to him, or there wasn't follow through on communication with him in terms of WB trying to sign him, and so he went to AEW. That's good stuff to know leading into the conversation about him being on AEW, as opposed to just reacting, oh, Jay White's here, awesome. But now we have context to what led him there, and I feel like it led to a much more interesting conversation.
How is a recap different? Because I know you have the good friendo that is the enforcer, that's basically like the third man, brother, for lack of a better word. So how is a recap different for you personally when, say, Steve goes on vacation or is unavailable and you're having to co-host with someone else, even though you two started this together?
We're extremely lucky to have Enforcer as our third man. He's hilarious. He knows his stuff. And he's a guy that both Steve and I have developed pretty good chemistry with. So for whatever reason, if I'm on vacation or Steve's on vacation and Enforcer steps in, it's a pretty seamless transition from our vantage point. Like usually I'll take notes for the shows, except for Raw, which we have Chris Garrix, who does an awesome job helping us out with notes for Raw and pay-per-views. But when the Enforcer knows that he has to fill in for a recap, he gets the pen and paper out and he starts jotting his own notes. And it's great hearing the notes from his perspective because he notices things that Steve and I don't, that we're like, oh, wow, that's a detail we missed. That's awesome. So having the Enforcer there for recaps is as seamless as a third man could be, I feel like, in this situation. In terms of like the streams with all three of us do together, it's tons of fun. It's tons of fun. Yeah, Enforcer's awesome dude. Love him.
100%. He's been on the channel before, and that was a lot of fun. So as we look at wrapping this up, because I do want to be respectful of your time, we are going to do a segment that I call generic questions. Those of you that have seen my interviews before will know this is where I will ask Larson questions that he might be asked on social media, such as his favorite wrestling match, favorite pay-per-view, favorite wrestler's theme, favorite tag team, and favorite wrestler. Questions that, like I say, he might be asked on social media. So now you guys will have a place to be like, to go and watch this and be like, and not have to ask him again, basically. So what's your favorite match of all time?
All right, off the top of my head, I'll say my favorite match of all time is the end of an era match between Triple H and Undertaker at Hell in a Cell. Some of the best in-ring storytelling I think I've ever seen. You have 4 years worth of story all culminating in that one match. You had Shawn Michaels back-to-back matches with Undertaker at WrestleMania, and they had Triple H's match the prior year. It's just really, it's fantastic stuff. Amazing match. And I always get bummed out when I look at WWE's own list of top WrestleMania matches, and that's like in the 20s. I'm like, this is easy top 5. Easy.
I would agree. Favorite pay-per-view of all time? I think I know the answer based on going in more viewing. I think.
Historically, it's been Survivor Series 98. Because there's so much story going on that one show. And you got that swerve at the end with The Rock realigning with Vince to win the title. from a wrestling perspective, it's not the best show in terms of the in-ring action, but from the stories being told throughout, it's a ton of fun.
Favorite wrestler's theme of all time?
Oh wow, that one's tough. Wrestler's theme. One that sticks out. There's a few that pop to mind, but one that always sticks out that whenever I hear it, and it's a bummer they just changed it recently, is Asuka's theme. Asuka's theme from NXT till maybe when she returned using the kind of like the Kana inspired makeup was amazing. Amazing. Fantastic theme.
Favorite tag team of all time?
If you'd asked me this 15 years ago, I probably would have said the Dudleys. Right now, I'll say the Lucha Brothers. Awesome team. Fantastic team. I really like the Lucha Brothers.
So we have a DeLorean, for example, and we can book the Dudleys versus the Lucha Bros. Who goes over and where are we booking it, Larson?
Let's do Dudleys versus Lucha Brothers. Let's do it. Let's do it at the Tokyo Dome. For this is gonna be out there for the IWGP tag titles, for the WWE tag titles, for the AAA tag titles, and the AEW tag titles. If time and space is gonna let us do whatever you want, that's what I'll do. Lucha Brothers go over.
And then finally, as we look at wrapping this up, who is your favorite wrestler of all time?
Again, historically, it was Shawn Michaels. Once I really got into his work in the late '90s, I was like, man, this guy is the best. He goes out there and puts his body on the line like very few of his contemporaries do, and puts on a hell of a match with anybody. I'll say this though, especially now that he's heel again, Bryan Danielson is starting to creep up. That heel promo he had on Dynamite this week was amazing. It made me miss the Planet's Champion.
I have a question for you about that.
Sure.
Do you think amateur is going to be his new fickle?
It could be. He really likes the word impotent because that's one word he used a lot as Planet's Champion. That's one he brought up during this promo. So he likes saying that. So hopefully we'll have him saying fickle again. But yes, amateur is pretty good if he's going to start insulting wrestlers.
I just love the way he was screaming amateur.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Bryan Danielson's great. One of the best in-ring workers ever. And he can do some really awesome character stuff too. So it's probably 1A and 1B at this point between Shawn Michaels and Bryan Danielson.
Okay, we did this for the tag team. So we're going to do it for the favorite wrestler again. We book Shawn Michaels versus Bryan Danielson. Where are we booking it and who goes over?
Let's book this. Let's kind of go the opposite we did with the Lucha Brothers and Dudleys, and that, we having this huge dome show for all the titles. Let's have this at the old ECW arena, because I believe Ring of Honor used to work there post ECW. And have a match using Ring of Honor pure rules, limited rope breaks, all that kind of stuff.
Ooh, this sounds fun.
What you'd think would play right into Bryan Danielson's wheelhouse. In fact, it would. I'd have Bryan Danielson go over.
Again, I'm just sad we won't see that now. So,
I know.
So as we wrap this up, Larson, the question I now end all my interviews on is with YouTube, with podcasting, with social media in general. We're all sort of going to live forever in some sort of very weird way, right? So what is one piece of content you want you and Guy Nimrod to be remembered for? And then what is one piece that you're like, we could press the delete button on that. I'd appreciate that.
Wow. When it comes to what Steve and I had done on Going in Raw, some of the stuff we've had the most fun doing, it's not even the podcast stuff, although that's always a lot of fun. Some of the most fun we've ever had is some of the gaming stuff we did with the WWE 2K games. We each booked our own e-feds. It was just silly stuff. And then we also had a series called We Book Raw, where we rebook some of the characters. And some of that stuff is the most fun we have ever had working together. And when that stuff was really good, I feel like that energy, that enthusiasm for it really communicated. And some of that stuff is, it didn't do as well, obviously, as some of the podcasting stuff. But some of those episodes, I think we're both really, really proud of. And if 30, 40 years from now, that got unearthed out of a time capsule, and that was the lone example of anything we ever provided to the universe, I'd be all right with that. As far as stuff that we could wipe from existence, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's some stuff we tried through the years that didn't quite work. That we wouldn't mind if no one watched it. But as far as going in raw stuff, I can't really think of anything that we'd want deleted from existence forever.
Fair enough. So as we wrap this up, where can the good people find you, Steve, and all your content?
So we're on YouTube, Stephen Larson, going in raw search. What Steve says, if you go on Google and search Stephen Larson, odds are you'll find us. If you do Stephen Larson going in raw, you're pretty much guaranteed to find our stuff. We got 2 YouTube channels. We got the Going in Raw channel for our podcast stuff. We got Friendo Club Wrestling for our short form content. At Real Going in Raw on Twitter. And then Steve and I both have individual Twitter accounts too, although we don't really use them a ton anymore. So if you want to get in touch with us or find our stuff, probably the At Real Going in Raw Twitter page is the place to go.
It's well worth doing, guys. Two people that really took a chance on me when I first started this channel, and I can't thank them enough for always being really good humans and really nice to me. So if you guys like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Tom Talk Trash. Follow me on Twitter at Tom Talk Trash, and I will see you in the next video. A goodbye now.